Anne Bradstreet is remarkable because she's not only the first famous writer we have, but she's the first American to get any kind of international recognition for their writing. The odds are enormously against that happening. When Anne starts out, what's the biggest obstacle she has to being published? The fact that she's a woman. Remember, the neoclassicists are the critics of the time. What do the neoclassicists think about the intellect of women?
Very low.
Very low, even less than most other people of the time. Because remember, they are those arrogant guys that think they're the smartest people ever born. They live to put other people down, and so if they don't think any other men measure up to them, they certainly don't think any women do. So the fact that she's a woman is a huge bar to publication. There were women who were being published then as poets, but again, they were all wealthy and they all published themselves. There wasn't anybody in Anne's position. Now, Anne wasn't poor by American standards, but in order to have an edition of a book put out, you had to be a lot wealthier than they were. And of course, there aren't really any facilities for printing in the United States. And all the way up through the 19th century, up to the middle of the 19th century, before the Civil War, almost all books read in America are written abroad. There doesn't become a real, it's Emerson saying we need a literature by Americans for Americans and about Americans. But there isn't much of all literature and all culture is over there. In fact, that's the second I wouldn't want to be watching this tape. The second big difficulty about being published is that she's an American. They felt that when you got on the boat for America, it didn't matter how sophisticated, how well educated you had been, that veneer of civilization washed off you right away. You were going to a savage place, you were going to live in savage circumstances, and you were going to become a savage. And the idea of America producing any kind of culture of its own wasn't even a concept. Now, those things surprisingly work to Anne's benefit. When the book is published, it's really a novelty book. And it's the fact that she is American and a woman that makes them even think about publishing. Because that was finding a woman and an American who could write poetry was like discovering a talking dog. The publisher assumed everybody's going to have to see this, an American woman who can write poetry. So in the long run, it works in her favor, but there's no reason for her to believe that it will work in her favor when she starts out. One of the biggest differences between her and Edward Taylor, beside the gender differences, is the fact that Anne wanted publication, and she wrote as if her works were going to be published, even though the likelihood was very low. Taylor, on the other hand, never wanted publication. There were 3 of his poems published during his lifetime, all anonymously and all without his permission. For him, the poems were a way of getting ready to preach a communion sermon the next day. They were a way of organizing his thoughts, and they were a kind of worship. But they were strictly between him and God. And what that meant is that he had a freedom that few other writers have had, except maybe Emily Dickinson. And that is, he didn't have to care what anybody thought of the poems. Nobody was going to see them but him and God. He could make them as complex as he wanted to. John Donne, the great metaphysical poet, even though he becomes the preacher to the court, and even though his audience is the best educated and supposedly most intelligent people in the land, nevertheless had to worry about whether he was going to go over their head when you know how those metaphysical conceits are, they're tough to figure out, and he had to worry, are they going to get this or not? If this is going to go over their head, you don't want the king reading your poem. You don't want to read your poem in front of the court and the king sits there feeling like he's too dumb to understand it. That's a real bad precedent. He can cut your head off for that. So even John Donne, great as he was, had to make compromises and had to worry about his audience. Taylor has no worries, so he writes with an absolute freedom. Anne, on the other hand, is limited by the desire for publication. And if you're going to get published, you can't really maintain your artistic vision completely, because if you really are an artist, you'll be ahead of your time. If you're too far ahead of your time, a publisher won't even look at what it is you're doing. Even if he does publish it and you're too far ahead of your time, you're going to have to wait for your audience to be born and grow up and learn how to read. It's often why writers get famous after they're dead, because that's when their audiences finally are born and become readers. Anne she's the first daughter of a guy who ran an estate for a duke. He had no sons, and so he treated Anne like a son. That is to say, he gave her the same kind of education that he would if he had had a boy. She had 6 tutors, and she spoke Greek and Latin, or read Greek and Latin, and she, because he ran this big estate, she had access to a pretty big library, and she had free run of it. She loved to read, and so she had a terrific education. When we look at Anne's feminism, it probably stems from that, from the fact that she was educated even by neoclassical standards. Her father dotes on her. She writes poetry. He encourages her to write poetry. She has a suitor named Simon Bradstreet. Her father likes him a lot. She likes him a lot. The marriage is idyllic even by modern standards. In those days, we've gone past where the marriage is arranged. Your father says you're marrying this guy and that's all there is to it. Now you can at least say no. You can tell him you like somebody a lot, but that doesn't mean he's going to give you his consent. Legally, you can marry without your father's consent. But socially, you probably can't. One, he'll disinherit you. Even if there isn't that much to disinherit you from, if you ran away and got married without your father's permission, probably nobody else in the family would talk to you. That would be a social stigma. A lot of people wouldn't want to deal with you because you had done that. So, considering that he was her father's choice as well, the marriage turns out extremely well. When your father, even though your father isn't picking you a husband, what does a woman look for above all else in a husband? Good looks, charming personality, security, the ability to make money. Marriage was largely a business proposition. A man expected to get a wife who could run a household and raise children. And a woman expected a good provider. And it was a more crucial decision for women than it was for men, because everything that happened to her for the rest of her life depended on the choice that she made for a husband. There isn't much in the way of jobs for a woman. There's probably only, well, what's the one job all women are trained for in those days and are brought up to believe is the only worthwhile job for a woman? Homemaker, mother, and running a household. If you didn't get married, and if you didn't get married and have children, you were considered to be unfulfilled. Your life was a failure. So when you picked a husband, you wanted to pick one that was going to be able to provide. Because you had a responsibility to the children you were going to have to find somebody who could bring home enough money to support you. If you married a guy just because he was cute and attractive and charming, lovable losers. They're all around. And now you can afford that. I mean, now it's great for women. You can have a boy toy. You can have somebody that you can support and they can stay home. But not in these times. You picked a husband who couldn't make a living. Not only were your children going to suffer, your old age is going to be a misery. There's no Social Security. What you have to get old on is what you manage to save up in the meantime. And if you don't find a husband who can make a considerable amount of money, it's going to be a tough old age. So women didn't follow their hearts. They followed their heads when they chose husbands. So the amazing thing is that this marriage works out so well from all we know of it? First of all, Simon is a good provider. I mean, he becomes a lieutenant governor, and then he becomes the governor. Right there, Anne had won, as far as her choice of husbands was concerned. But she really goes beyond what anybody expected to get out of a marriage. How about the passionate side of marriage? You read the poems. Her husband absent upon public employment.
Well, she misses him.
She misses him. She misses him physically. It's not about the good advice he gives her on how to raise the children. It's not about how much she misses his conversation. When she looks at those children, she sees the heat in which they were born, the passion in which they were made. She's talking about missing her husband physically, which that's a very erotic poem when you think about it. For a Puritan woman to talk about how much she needs her husband physically, that was way out of bounds for a Puritan woman. And it shows you that they had a passionate relationship. That's bonus time. You got a husband who could provide, that was the best you could hope for. A husband who provided that you really actually fell in love with, hardly anybody got that. She got something even beyond that. And that is a husband who talked to her and treated her like an equal. A husband who admired her intellectually. That's really surprising. I think probably that part of Simon's success had to be that, unlike almost every other husband, he talked about his work and about the world with his wife. Husband and wives talked, but they didn't really talk. Well, they didn't talk all that much, come to think of it. What would a woman have to talk about to her husband anyway? The children. And all he really needed to know was who needs to be beaten and how much. And that was basically what she told him. He wouldn't have wanted to hear about how tough her day was and who threw up and who spilled their milk. Well, how about telling her about his day at work? It's a hard day. You'd think maybe he would want to come home and vent a little bit about that. Did husbands do that? Why not?
Because maybe they didn't feel like they understood.
Women wouldn't understand it. It was the outside world. It was business. You can't expect them to grasp that. How about at least talking to your wife about the way you feel? The business looks like it's in real trouble. You're afraid you're going to get bankrupt. You don't know what's going to happen with the rest of your life. You're really worried about that and a little bit afraid. Would husbands have told that to their wife? Not with a gun to their head. They probably wouldn't even have told it to themselves. And Anne and Simon really seemed to share the whole of their lives. Again, I think he succeeds because he does talk to her about politics, and he does talk about what's going on. And that gives him an insight which no other politician that he's in competition with has. All they have is the male perspective of what it is that's going on. Now, in general, women have a much keener sense of social interaction than men have. They're much better at picking up nuances, especially social nuances. When you go to a party with your significant other and halfway through you find yourself storming out behind her and you've got no clue who insulted you or how they did it, and it takes a 20-minute explanation before you're saying, "Is that what that meant? Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure." "Okay." She could see the subtleties that he wouldn't have been able to see. Now, I'm sure that there were other wives who maybe were trying to insinuate their opinions into their husbands' thinking, but their husbands were largely ignoring them. And Simon was listening to what Anne had to say. And the other thing, of course, about Anne is that she is an absolute master manipulator. And she manipulates men better than she manipulates anybody else, as you may already have noticed from reading her work. I don't necessarily mean that in a bad sense. Everybody's looking for what they want out of the world, and bright people tend to be able to manipulate people better than other people because they can see a broader picture of things. And also, how many of you are married? Then you know that marriage is largely a matter of negotiations and maneuvers, and it's not plots, and it's not that you hate one another. It's a kind of intellectual game that goes on. Any relationship, actually you don't have to be married. If you're in any kind of long-term relationship, you probably come to this already. People have different desires and different interests, and so everybody wants to get their own way. And there's a lot of compromise and a lot of back and forth that's going on in a marriage. And maybe that's probably one of the more enjoyable parts of it. I mean, here's Anne, I just happen to be especially good at it. Although Simon is no dummy. Anne writes poetry. Do you think she would have stopped writing poetry if Simon had told her to? I don't think so either. She seems to be a very, very strong personality. If she did stop, I'm sure it would have caused a lot of tension between them, and there would have been a lot of problems. She might even have written secretly. You know what secrets do to relationships. I think Simon knew she wouldn't have stopped either. Now, if you're a smart politician and you see a mob, you find out where the mob is going, and then you get out in front of it and lead it there. If your wife won't stop writing poetry, what's the smart thing to do?
Let her.
Yeah, let her. Encourage her. This is wonderful stuff. Write some more. Then he comes off looking like the good guy, and there was no way he could stop her anyway. And Simon was smart enough to see that. I think probably Simon deferred to her opinion of things fairly often. Now, when you look at Anne, when you look at what she writes, the topics that she uses, the subjects, birth of one of her children, her husband being away, her house catching on fire, for the most part, they're ordinary events of daily life. Does that make her a neoclassical writer or a metaphysical writer?
Metaphysical.
Metaphysical. The neoclassicists, remember, poetry is only for the highest subjects. Ordinary daily events, ordinary daily objects, they don't belong in a poem. A poem should be elevated above ordinary mundane life. It's philosophy boiled down and distilled. Anne writes about what a metaphysical. Remember, the metaphysicals make metaphysical conceits. The unlikely objects that they compare ideas to are almost always drawn out of ordinary commonplace life. And so commonplace life is important. Remember, it's the life of the artist for the metaphysical. So she has metaphysical subjects. There are a couple poems, which we're going to look at length, where she seems to be clearly neoclassical, however. Because she's metaphysical, and because her approach seems to be, I mean, if you look at her, to her husband absent upon public employment, is that poem written emphasizing the intellect or the emotions? Emotions is all about how much she misses him and how much she loves him. It's not. If it were a neoclassical poem, and you're going to write on what to do when your husband's away. First thing it would do would be, remember, they give advice. So first it would identify, what are the problems when your husband's away? You have to discipline the children yourself instead of him doing it. You can't sign anything legal. You can't enter any agreements, binding agreements when he's gone. The men that work for you don't treat you with any respect and don't listen to your orders. The workmen try to rob you. And probably what you would do about them. Now, those are four things. Probably a neoclassicist would take one of them per poem and tell you what the problem is and what the solution is. They would give you advice on how to deal with it. She doesn't do that at all. She deals entirely with how she feels. That's probably one of her most clearly metaphysical poems. On the other hand, so at first you might think that she's basically an emotional person. But she was probably one of the brightest people in the colonies. Okay, granted, there aren't a huge number of people in the colonies, and maybe that isn't that hard, but she's one of the smartest people around. And you can't be that bright and not be pretty intellectual in your thinking. In other words, you may have a lot of emotion, but your intellect probably overrides it most of the time. The best example of the intellect in Anne Bradstreet is probably before the birth of one of her children. Leading cause of death well up into the 20th century for women. What is it? Childbirth. So for a healthy woman, giving birth was playing Russian roulette with probably 2 bullets in the gun. Anne is not in that good a health. So she's facing a much higher probability, a much higher possibility, if not probability, of dying every time she gives birth. And she writes on the birth of one of her children when she's in labor. Let me, on the side here for a second, in terms of that intellectuality. She's a Puritan, but she's not the kind of Puritan Bradford was, or the kind that Taylor is. Faith doesn't come easy to her. You'll see the same thing happen when we get to Emily Dickinson, a woman raised in a religious family who has a lot of trouble believing. And there are times when Emily Dickinson is sure that there's a deity, and there's times when she's sure death is the end of everything. Anne struggles. I think Anne probably believes there's a God all the time, but Anne struggles to believe the way Puritans believe, to accept things. When she talks, I don't think we read The Burning of Her House, did we? Well, in that, she talks about how bad she felt that all this stuff was burned up. Not only that there was no insurance, but these were irreplaceable things. And only after about 2/3 of the poem does she go back to being intellectual and say, well, but that's God's will. He took away those things here because there are greater treasures for me there, because I was clinging too much to the things of this world. She eventually comes to a Puritan perspective on the world, but it's almost always when her intellect intervenes. So she's writing this poem in labor, facing possible death within the hour, and she writes a poem. She not only writes a poem, she writes a poem with fixed meter and with fixed rhyme. That's pretty intellectual. But it goes well beyond that. What is she most worried about in that poem? There are 1 or 2 problems mentioned, but there's one that's the most significant. First of all, she's got this passionate love affair marriage with Simon Bradstreet. Does she think that he's going to grieve forever after she dies? No. I mean, emotionally, you're in love, you think your husband's as much in love with you, and you think, well, I would never get over his death, so he probably will never get over mine. But you notice she doesn't think with her heart there, she thinks with her mind. She knows he's going to get remarried. It's a dead certainty. All of the forces of society would have conspired to make sure that he got married. Why?
Take care of the baby.
He's got kids that have to be taken care of. He can't do that by himself. He's the governor. The governor's got to have a wife. Yeah, almost all the leaders were married. And of course, every man was an unfilled job. So that every woman in the colonies would have been conspiring to get somebody married off to Simon Bradstreet. It was not just a job going begging, it was a great job going begging. So he's going to get remarried. She accepts that. What's she worried about after he does get remarried? The stepmother, the wicked stepmother. Protect from stepdame's injury. And she's realistic. This is an intellectual approach. She doesn't think, oh, well, he'll marry the nicest, sweetest person he can. What do second wives generally look like?
Not so good.
They look just like the wife that just died, or that you just divorced? No, they look like the babysitter. They're going to be young. His next wife is going to be young and pretty. Now, you're young, and your main stock in trade is your looks, and you're stepping into the shoes of the brightest woman in America. You're stepping into a relationship which was idyllic beyond the wildest fantasies of the times. How are you going to feel about that? Confident? No, you're going to be intimidated by that. You're going to think, well, maybe it's a possibility that he might marry somebody who says, well, I know he won't love me as much as he loved Anne, and hey, there's only one Anne Bradstreet, and I'm certainly not her, but I think he loves me now, and that's the best I can do. Besides, it's a great, even if he doesn't love me, this is a good marriage. I'm going to make it work. I'm going to be nice to the children. I'm going to be a good mother. That might have happened. And Anne takes that into consideration. This is where the real intellect comes in. Here she is, again, facing death. She sees that as a future problem. She doesn't give him the poem as she's about to give birth and they shoo him out of the room. Because if she does, and she dies, he reads the poem then, his grief is extended by another 2 or 3 years. But sooner or later, he's going to get remarried. When he gets remarried, she takes the poem instead and puts it in her papers. If she dies, when will he find that? Anybody ever have to go through somebody's papers that they loved when they died?
You don't go through them for a long time.
You don't go through them for a long time. It's years and years before you can force yourself to do that. My guess is that a guy won't go through them ever, unless there's some legal reason that he has to go through them. So he'll never look at that. And if he marries the sweet, loving wife who accepts that she's not Anne, he'll never find that poem. But if he marries that good-looking young girl who feels intimidated by Anne's presence and who's going to be jealous of Anne, she's going to say to him sooner or later, why are her things still here? That's when he's going to have to go through them. Now, if you have a woman who's jealous of the former wife's papers, how is she going to treat the children? Horribly. I mean, if this is the papers represent the old relationship, the children certainly do. So in other words, he won't find that poem unless he marries the kind of wife who would be mean to the children. And then he's going to find that poem at exactly the time he needs to be reminded that he loved her once, and he owes her, and he owes that love the obligation of protecting his children. She brings that up to him as a possibility. You got this great-looking young wife. Do you even want to know that she's being mean to the children? No, if you do, you got to deal with it. So if it's going on, she knows what Simon is like. Simon's a guy. He's got other things on his mind. He's not going to jeopardize that relationship, so he's going to be turning a blind eye. But when he finds that poem, she brings it home to him. This is a problem, and you've got responsibility here, and if you ever loved me, and I know you did, and you've got to protect him. But again, how intellectual it is to set that up. I mean, that's a trap that won't be sprung for maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the line. You're going facing death in an hour, and you still have enough presence of mind to set up a plot that won't hatch for 5 years. That's an intellectual. When we look at the author to her book, at first thing we have there is, you remember the extended metaphors? Everything in the poem, you compare two things, and everything in the poem has to be about both of them. Comparing her book to a child is almost classical. Many writers have referred to their books as their children, that they're their offspring. That's what's going to live on after you. That's what you pass on to the world. And if she just compared it to a child, she might be neoclassical. But look at the kind of child she compares it to. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain. What does ill-formed mean? Sorry. Defective. It has got birth defects. This is a badly formed child. You wouldn't expect somebody to compare their book to a badly formed child, a child with birth defects. That's metaphysical. That's unlikely. Then she continues the comparison to a child, who after birth did by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, less smart than faithful. When you gave birth at home. Right after they cleaned up the baby, they put it next to you, and that was pretty much where it stayed. And the book, at first, Anne writes her poems. She keeps them in manuscript. She reads them as entertainment for people when they come over to dinner. They did a pretty fair amount of entertaining, more than likely, as the lieutenant governor and governor of the colony. It circulated among friends also in manuscript. When her brother-in-law goes to England, she gives him a copy of the book to read on the way. Now, Professor Callender thinks that she knew all along he was going there to publish it, and that she intended it to be published, and she intended him to go look for a publisher. But anybody at the time, publication was kind of putting yourself forward. It was kind of presumptuous. And nobody wanted to be seen to be that arrogant. So it was commonplace, according to Professor Callender, for people to get somebody else, a friend of theirs, to take their work and publish it, and then they got to go, oh no, I'm so shocked. I didn't think they were that good myself. I wouldn't have tried to publish them. So you don't have to take responsibility for it. And he feels that she gave the brother-in-law the book and told him to look for a publisher. I don't think she did. I think she thought that he would read it on the way over, but she never really thought anybody would be interested in it because the odds were so enormous against it. However it happens, he does come to a publisher, and he does show the publisher the book, and the publisher doesn't say to himself, this is the greatest poetry I've ever read. What he says to himself is, I can make a buck out of this one. It is good poetry, and it's by a woman, it's by an American, and I can bring out a novelty edition of this. Everybody's going to want to see something that unusual. The brother-in-law comes back, I don't remember his name, thinking that Anne is going to be overjoyed that he's gotten her book published. But instead, she's horrified. She's horrified because how are the critics going to be disposed towards her anyway? They're going to be favorably disposed, or are they going to be hostile?
Hostile.
They're going to be hostile because she's a woman. And the process generally, when you do a book, you put the poems through a number of drafts, you get a final draft of them, you send it off to the publisher. They accept it, an editor goes over it, an editor writes a lot of notes on it, suggesting changes. A couple of the changes you make, and the rest of them you fight tooth and nail not to make. But eventually you make changes. And in the process of fighting them, or in the process of making the changes that they want, you make some revisions of your own. So you're really changing the manuscript so that when it goes to print, it's as good as you can possibly make it. Because when you do put it in print, you're going to have problems anyway. There's no uniform dictionary, and there's no uniform spelling, and there's no uniform grammar. So that every typesetter often had his own way to spell things. And modern scholars can take an early folio of Shakespeare's work and tell you when the typesetter went off duty and another one came on, because the spelling of major words changes. So they're going to make some mistakes. So some mistakes are unavoidable, and even men's works will have mistakes in them, but they'll at least be putting their best work out when it goes to the printer. She's got not certainly a first draft, but not really a final draft either over there. And so they're setting her poems in type from less than the best possible form she could have put them in. So she's got to compete on an uneven playing field with men with less than her best work. That's why she says her friends were less wise than true. They were faithful to her. Her brother-in-law wanted to do something nice for her. He didn't realize, though, because he didn't really understand what the competition was, that he was putting her into a bad position. That's why when she gets the book back, she's really kind of appalled by it. I mean, she always wanted publication, and part of her had to be happy seeing that book with her name on it. But on the other hand, once you started to look at it, the errors jump out at you anyway, and even more so in this case. Who thee abroad exposed to public view. There's a pun in there. Remember how much the metaphysicals loved puns. Abroad meaning in public. What else does abroad mean? If you went
Across the ocean.
across the ocean, overseas, he took it to England. So he took it abroad, and he also took it abroad in the sense of being public. Exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge. There's like several different puns involved in that. On one level, she's comparing this ugly baby to a poor child. Now, if you got in debt in those days and couldn't pay, you went to debtor's prison. The whole family went. The wife and the children could come and go, but the husband had to stay there all the time, and they lived in the prison. Sometimes to pay off the work, they had to do manual labor. And it was a thing called the press, which was like a big wheel, and it had handles that came up. You had to push that, and there were little handles for the children. This book has been sent out to earn money. Her brother gave it to the publisher. The publisher wanted to make money out of it, so it set it to work, just like a poor child being put to work. There's also a pun in made thee in rags. What's paper made out of? Wood pulp, mostly. Something else. And you get bond paper? Fibers, the rag content. It's also made of chopped up rags. So when you put it in paper, you put it in rags. And beside the meaning of this machine is the press also meant the crowd. And what else was the press?
Printing press.
The printing press. So she's got three different meanings to that. That's definitely metaphysical. When you got a line that can mean three things equally, of course you definitely have a metaphysical line. Where errors were not lessened, all made judge. So when it was taken to the printers, they made a whole bunch of mistakes in spelling and stuff as well. At thy return, my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. Now this is a real metaphysical conceit, because she's not just comparing it to an ill-formed child, this is an illegitimate child. In those days, if you got pregnant out of wedlock, that was a big scandal. And as soon as they found out you were pregnant, they sent you away before you began to show, and you lived with relatives or somebody else far away, had the baby, put it on somebody's doorstep, and came back like nothing ever happened. Only she says this book coming back from England was like having had a baby, gotten rid of it, thinking you escaped that scandal, and 2 years later in print, it's pulling on your dress and calling you mommy in public. It's that kind of humiliation as far as he's concerned. And of course, that's a metaphysical conceit. Nobody would have thought of comparing it to an illegitimate child. I cast thee by as one unfit for life. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. If you had a really, really ugly baby with any kind of deformity, what did they do with them? Assuming that they tried to let them die, but if it wouldn't die, what did they do?
Shut them up.
Shut them up and lock them away, just like they did with anybody who had any emotional or psychological problems. Chained them up in the cellar in the attic. If you read those 19th century novels where this love affair is going on and there's these sounds from somewhere else in the great house, and later in the book you find out it's the crazy wife chained up there, that wasn't all that unlikely. That kind of stuff went on all the time. So she says this was a book that it was like they had an ugly baby and you just put it away. Somebody did, put it in a dark place where nobody could ever see it. Tell everybody it didn't live. When she first gets the book, she starts to look at it. There's all these mistakes in it. She can't even bear to look at it, so she puts it aside. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. Yeah, it's an ugly baby, but it is her baby. No matter what you think of of the baby, first of all, newborns there aren't any good-looking ones really anyway. I mean, you keep anything in liquid for that long, it's not going to be in very good shape. 3-4 weeks down the line, they start to puff out a little bit, then maybe they start to get cute. But generally, newborns are pretty awful. My daughter's a really beautiful woman and was a beauty queen and a lot of other things, so she grew up fine. She was not a pretty baby. And when we looked at her, my wife said, "Oh my God, she looks like you." I said, "Oh my God, she looks like me." But she grew out of that and became beautiful. But even if she hadn't been, she started to get, even the first hour or two, she started looking better to us. So, but after a day or so, we thought she was pretty good looking. But the families and stuff showed up. We were saying, oh, isn't it a good looking baby? Started to look more like, I guess it was, maybe the whole birth trauma made her look more beat up and like me. But it started to look more like my wife, so it got to be good. In any case, though, it wouldn't have mattered. No matter how ugly your baby is, it starts to look better to you the more you look at it, and it's your baby, and so she feels this attachment. Yeah, there's problems in it, but it's her book. And maybe she could fix it. Now, actually, this poem was supposed to be the introduction to a new volume of her first book, The 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America. You notice he got America in that title to attract the readers, and the muses were the goddesses of poetry. There are 9 of them, so this is the 10th. She decides she'll try to fix it. Now, it was supposed to be the introduction to the book, but as it happened, she died before the book was finished being put together. And they didn't find the poem until almost the whole book was set in type. So it became the last poem in the book instead of the... You see why she was so upset whenever the publishers got their hands on it. It was the last poem in the book when it was supposed to be the first one that talked about how she had taken the old book and tried to fix it up. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. So she looks at this ugly kid and thinks, well, maybe he'll clean up nice. But the more she cleans him up, the more you can see how ugly it is. She tries to fix the book. She tries to make changes in the manuscript. Now it's done in ink. So in order to make a change, you've got to either cross it out or you've got to try to erase it. Well, there are no erasers, and there certainly aren't any ink erasers, so you've got to put a little bit of water on and then dab and rub at it until you blot away the ink. Well, what happens when you try to do that? It smears. And now you want to try to get rid of the smears, you got to put a little bit more water on and rub a little harder, and then what happens? Smears more, and you end up with a hole in the paper. So that nightmare where you got something that you have to fix, and no matter what you do, it just keeps making it worse and worse. Oh, never mind, that's real life. So the more she tries to fix this thing, the more mistakes she makes on it. I stretch thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runst more hobbling than is meet, yet you still run with more of a limp than is proper, than is meet. She compares the book now to a child with one leg shorter than the other. And in those days, they would have put the child in traction all the time and tried to stretch it out. There's also a pun here. What is a foot in poetry?
A line.
Well, it's not a full line. It's a measure of rhythm. Like a certain number of beats are a foot. There are different kinds of feet. So she says, here's the poem. Now remember, for the neoclassicist, if you have a certain number of feet, a certain number of beats per line, it always has to be the same. Well, some of her lines are too short. So she tries to stretch them out. But even when she does, the rhythm of the poem hobbles along. It limps along more than is proper. So she's still, even though she tries to fix the poem, she can't adjust it enough. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but not save homespun cloth in the house I find. Her vision of getting her book published was probably with a leather-bound copy on vellum paper. You've seen those old, really expensive books, and the outside edges of the paper has a color to it, and gold embossed lettering. The book was brought out as a novelty book. What do you figure the physical layout of the book was? Cheap. You want to sell this to a lot of people. This is for people who just want to see if any American could write that good, or any woman could write that good. So it came out in a cheap edition. She idealized it as coming out in something better.
Do you think they did that also because she was a woman? They made it that way because she was a woman?
That's probably a good point. They may have, because just in case nobody will buy this anyway, because it is a woman's. I mean, there were certainly neoclassicists who would have said, it's by a woman, it can't possibly be worth reading, and who wouldn't even have picked it up. So they're not going to lose any money either way. And that's probably had to be, she had these grand, the fantasies of success that everybody has. And then you get what it was you fantasized about, and it's never as good as it was the way you thought about it being. And here she has this image of this really a nicely done book, and it's this basically a cheap paperback that she ends up with. So that's kind of disheartening. In this array, mongst vulgars mayest thou roam, ordinary people. A cheap book is going to end up with the people who can easily afford it. And this is this is one of my favorite lines in this poem. Probably every writer loves this line. In critics' sands beware thou dost not come. Who do you warn children about?
Strangers.
Just strangers? You don't want them to meet anybody new? Who is it you really are warning them about? You call them strangers.
Bad strangers.
Bad strangers. Child molesters. What a great metaphysical conceit that is. A critic is like a child molester. You give it the child of your brain and it does awful things to it. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. So it's the upper class of society she thinks hasn't really read her book. And that's where she'd like this one to go, because it was going to be a better edition. If for thy father ask, say thou hadst none. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of doors. Again, we go back to that child out of wedlock that hasn't got a father. Well, why doesn't this book have a father?
She wrote it.
Because a woman wrote it. All it has is a woman. That's one of those early references to Anne's feminism. It's that little dig, because everybody will assume that a man wrote it. This one doesn't have one. It only has a woman. So we have 4 or 5 metaphysical conceits. It's an extended metaphor. It's got multiple layers of meaning to it, all of which make it neoclassical or metaphysical. Metaphysical. Anne's probably a metaphysical writer. But she ends up writing at least one poem of the ones that we read where she's about as neoclassical as you can get. And that's the prologue. And the prologue was, there are a number of reasons why she would want to be neoclassical in this. The first one is, when this book comes out, now this was the prologue, the introduction to a long religious epic poem. The epic poem is the poem of classicism. That's the poem of the classical world. Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, they're epics. The epic is the hardest kind of poem there is to write. You have to have the fictional skills of a novelist, and yet you have to be able to write it in verse. You have to be able to keep the same meter throughout. You have to set up a rhyme scheme, and you have to follow that throughout. And the poem is thousands and thousands of lines long. Only the best poets would even attempt to write an epic. Who are the critics? Metaphysicals and neoclassicists.
Neoclassicists.
Neoclassicists. The metaphysicals didn't criticize. They wanted originality. They wanted those bizarre comparisons. If they criticized, they knew they weren't always going to get them. In other words, if the metaphysicals had been critical as well, metaphysical poets would have thought, well, is this comparison going too far? Am I over the top on this one? Maybe I should pull back a little bit. So you'd never get those really extreme ones. So the metaphysical's philosophy for criticism was basically, go for it. And now I didn't like it this time, maybe, but I might like it next time. Because the poem's a new poem every time you pick it up. But the neoclassicists, of course, are looking to carve up anybody who dares to pick up a pen and set themselves up alongside of Homer and the other great writers. So they're going to, anybody, male or female, who tried to write an epic could have expected that they were going to get a hostile reception from the neoclassical critics. They would have been out to get everybody. But a woman out to write an epic, they're definitely going to be out to get her. So the first thing that a neoclassical poet has to do is to establish their credentials. I know my neoclassicism. Therefore, I am a literate person. I'm the smartest person around, and that's the person who ought to be the poet. Remember, in that hierarchy of things, the poet was always at the top. So a modern poet's got to be smarter than everybody else if they're the ones who are going to be picking up the pen. Then you've got to establish that early on. You certainly have to establish it when you know you've got a bunch of hostile critics. And she does that right in the beginning of the poem. She puts in two references to the same classical work in the first two lines. To sing of wars and captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen, my humble pen, are two superior things, or are they all in each their dates have run? Let poets and historians set these forth, my obscure lines will not so dim their worth. So the first two lines there, to sing of wars of captains and of kings, is an echo of the Aeneid, which begins of arms and the man I sing. Now later on in the poem she says, if what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, else it was by chance. This is a reference then to the Iliad. So if a neoclassicist says to another neoclassicist, hey, that's a pretty good first line, what will the second one say? Of course it is. She stole it from the Aeneid. But she knows where it came from. You're supposed to take stuff from the classical writer. And that's why she puts that second line in. Of cities founded, commonwealths begun. The Aeneid is about the fall of Troy, the escape of Aeneas, and it ends up with the founding of Rome, a city and a commonwealth. So in other words, that second hint tells you, I know where this came from. Here's a little summary of what it was. She's doing two things there. One, she's challenging the neoclassicists. She throws out a subtle classical allusion, which a good neoclassicist should have picked up. And if they didn't pick it up in line 1, she puts line 2 in as a little hint to say, got that one past you. And the second thing she does is when they look at the first line and say, yes, it's stolen from the Aeneid, the second line says, I know it's from the Aeneid. It isn't stolen. So she heads off that argument that she sees coming. First thing she does then is establish her ability, her understanding of the classical period. The second thing that she does, you notice in that, she says that she's not going to try to write a real epic. A real epic was usually about historical events and about wars. I mean, that's what the Iliad's all about, the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. She's not going to do that. She's trying to write a religious epic. And she does. The fact that she's writing a religious epic makes that less threatening to the neoclassicists. There were no classical religious epics. Ovid's Metamorphoses is sort of one, but it's about paganism. So it's really the stories of the gods. It's not theology. So there isn't any model that she could have taken. So it's not like she's trying to do something that Homer did. She's not putting herself on the same plane as him. But she wants to make that clear right away. Why does she want to make that clear that she's not trying to write a classical epic? So they'll be less hostile towards it. It's not as arrogant as it seems. Then she says, well, let poets, like she isn't a poet. Let poets write about that. I won't even try to write about that. My obscure lines will not so dim their worth. For me to write about historical subjects would just trivialize them, and I won't even try to do that to them. Why is she pretending to be so humble?
Basically, so they will go easier.
So they'll go easy on you. You got a boss. Your boss comes in and starts yelling at you for some mistake you made. If after they've shouted for a little while, you say, this is awful, what an idiot I am, this is so dumb, I've ruined everything, oh, this is terrible. Will they keep yelling at you? No. And that's what she does. She's got these supposedly really bright guys, and the first thing she does is manipulate them. She says, oh, I know I can't do this. And they say, well, it's a good thing, Anne, that you know your place. At least that you've got that right. Let's not beat up on her too bad. She knows how bad she is. And after all, she is a Puritan, and they feel compelled to do these religious poems and stuff, so we ought to let her go on that. And they did.
She must be turning in my grave right now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's by the time we get to the end of this poem, I mean, it's really embarrassing for guys to read this poem because it's so manipulative of the male critics of the time and of men in general. Another reason why she has to seem humble, there are two other reasons actually. One is poets generally started out their poems talking about how they weren't really up to the task for this reason. You made a living as a poet, you did it by having a patron. And basically, when you got a patron, you were like a live-in greeting card. The Duke could come to you and say, it's the Duchess's birthday tomorrow, I'm giving her emeralds, and her favorite color is blue, so when emeralds mentioned, I want a lot of blue in there. Ducks, she likes ducks. I want some ducks in the poem, and tell her how gorgeous she is, and oh yeah, her dress, silk, she likes silk. I want some silk in there too. But you got to write poems on demand like that. The first thing you want to say is, nobody could do this job. But I'm going to give it, I can do it as good as anybody, but nobody could really do this. That way, when the Duke comes back and says, she didn't like the poem, you're fired, you get to say, but Your Grace, no, but she's so beautiful. She's so wonderful. Nobody has words for that. Homer couldn't do her justice. All right, wait here, I'll talk to her. Yeah, she said you can stay. She is too wonderful for words. In fact, she liked that. Too wonderful for words. So you're okay. One of the ways to get ahead in the world is to lower people's expectations. Somebody comes and says, well, I really need this done by Friday. You don't say, I'll have it for you. You say, Friday? If I worked overtime and took everybody I know and worked overtime, and we couldn't get this done until Tuesday at least. Friday, I thought, I'll try, but and then of course late Friday, you had it done since Thursday. They show up and say, well, did you get any of it? Oh yeah, here it is. We knew it was you. So, and then they think, wow, you did a miracle for me. Wow, that's great. Just by lowering their expectation. I mean, you get away. One of the ways to get through the world is once you learn how to play stupid. Generally, especially if you're male and young, you won't do that. When I was young, the police would pull me over. If I didn't go to jail, I was lucky. Because I had to confront. It was all that testosterone. But now I don't have any more. What happens to you, by the way, when you get to be 40 years old, this is why guys mellow, there's a little pack of cells in your brain called locus coeruleus. And it's responsible for your testosterone levels and adrenaline. And it burns out.
He's making this up.
I'm not. This local coeruleus is real. I don't make any of this stuff up. I forget a lot of it, but it burns out, and that's why guys mellow somewhere around 40 or so. I mean, you have to remember, they mellow from where they started. Some of us are stone lunatics to begin with, so we come down to just average lunatics. Now, if I get stopped for speeding, first thing I do is open up the glove compartment and take out all of my licenses since 1984. And I drop them on the seat and on the floor, and I go through them and I give them 90, oh, okay, that's 95. No, that's 98. And then that goes on for about 5 minutes. Now the guy who stops me is thinking, stupid old man. Okay with me? 2000. No, it's 2001. Okay, let me look for that. Okay, here it is. Oh, registration. How to come to registration? By that time, it's, okay, look. I'm letting you go this time. You can't go 75 in a school zone. 75. Was I going 75? This it's so different than my other car. I mean, there's a little thing that tells me when I'm at 55, and this just doesn't beep, and I don't know. Go away, go away. So if you learn how to play stupid, you can get by in the world, and that's what Anne does. She's playing dumb. Oh, and that's what poets did. Oh, I can't possibly do this, and then they do it the best they can, and everybody thinks it's a miracle. How about as a Puritan? Why as a Puritan would she have taken this pose?
That's how they...
Got to be humble, can lose your election being proud. So she's saying, well, I know I can't really do this, but I feel compelled morally to do it, but I know I'm only a woman. You know, she's not just playing to the neoclassics here by saying I'm only a woman, she's also playing to the Puritans. Because they're going to be going, oh, a woman is writing a religious epic? I don't know about this. So she disarms the critics, both the male Puritans and the male neoclassics right off the bat. Then the second stanza, she tells you how much she admires some guy. Now, there were no classical models for her to take. So as a woman, who should she have, since she couldn't go to Greece and Rome to learn how to do this, who should she have gone to? A man. And that's what she does. He tells you about Du Bartas. Now, Du Bartas was, this is before Milton. Milton wrote the greatest religious epic in the English language, the Paradise Lost. This is before him, so Du Bartas is the big religious epic writer. And she goes to him for a model. But the praise she gives to Bartas, now every writer admires other contemporary writers. No matter how talented you are, there are other writers who do things that you just know you couldn't do. You couldn't write that way. Your style is just totally different, and you admire that. And she probably did admire Du Bartas, but I don't think she admired him this much. But when my wondering eyes and envious heart great Bartas' sugared lines do but read o'er, fool, I do grudge the muses did not part twixt him and me that overfluent store. Oh, I look at Du Bartas and I wish the muses had given me half of his talent. I'd be so much better than I am. He's so great. A Bartas can do what a Bartas will, but simple I according to my skill. Why that's such a great line is what she does next. You remember that having too many beats in a line is considered a flaw. And you had to have exact rhyme. The neoclassics liked exact rhyme. First, on one level, she's playing that same game she played in the first stanza. Poor me, don't beat up on me. I'm just helpless and defenseless. From schoolboy's tongue, no rhetoric we expect. Rhetoric was one of the three basic subject areas for a university education. And so somebody who's just starting out in school, you don't expect them to write like a university graduate. So she says, this is my first epic. I'm a rookie. You have to cut me some slack here. Nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings. Now the implied metaphor there is a comparison between her poetry and her poetic instrument and the instrument that was associated with poetry in the classical tradition. It's what they accompanied their poetry with. Anybody know what it was?
The lyre.
The lyre, that U-shaped harp. So she says, you can't expect me to make beautiful music on my lyre because it has a broken string. Why are her strings broken on her poetic instrument? Because she's a woman. I got this damaged instrument. You can't expect me to make beautiful music. Nor perfect beauty wears a main defect. And that's a clever line because the neoclassics didn't like contractions very much anyway. They thought that was a way of cheating and making the beats come out right. But any grammarian, even a modern, won't let you get away with contracting three words into one. Where's is a contraction of where there is. In other words, it's a main defect. What's the odds of making a main defect in a line about main defects by accident? 0. Or close to 0. Pretty slim. Remember, she said later, if what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen. Yeah, it comes from the Aeneid. Or it's by chance. So in other words, some critics said, well, that was pretty clever. She talked about mistakes. She made a mistake. All the other neoclassicists would have said, don't be ridiculous. That's way too bright for a woman to do. This has got to be a coincidence. She knows that's coming because she does it again. My foolish, broken, blemished muse, the goddess in charge of her poetry, is all banged up because she's a woman, so sings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, because nature made it so. If you say irreparable, it doesn't rhyme with able. And if you say irreparable, then the beats are off in the poem. In other words, it's an irreparable mistake. In a line where she talks about a major mistake, she makes a major mistake. In a line where she talks about a mistake that can't be fixed, she makes a mistake that can't be fixed. If you fix the rhyme, you can't fix the meter. If you fix the meter, you can't fix the rhyme. And we know it's no accident because you notice it's not because. She dropped that off. She dropped that syllable off to make sure that it wouldn't come out right. Now, to break the rules, you have to know the rules. If you've ever seen anybody who's a gymnast clown on a piece of apparatus, they have to be really good. And it's the same way here. To intentionally break the rules, you have to really know the rules. So and remember how she introduced that? But simple I, according to my skill. And then she shows you a really high level of skill. Does she think the neoclassics are going to pick that up? And even if they do, they can't admit it to themselves. I mean, you'd have to say, a woman could be that clever, maybe we made a mistake about women. So they've got to just not see that it's there. But as you'll see, I think she knew that sooner or later she would have an audience who would. Let's take a break until 8:30, and then we'll finish her up and do Taylor.
She's lucky. John Woodward's
She was really smart.
He's lucky.
That way you flush it all out.
I definitely could.
Ready?
I'd leave
Made the
my
bathroom all
system
day.
out with NyQuil and just dousing myself in it and just going to bed.
Not only does she manipulate the neoclassics, she also takes a couple swipes at them, which I'm sure probably went over their head as well. Nor can I like that fluent, sweet-tongued Greek, who lisped at first, in future times speak plain. By art he gladly found what he did seek, a full requital of his striving pain. Art can do much, art in a sense of method. But this maxim's most sure. A weak or wounded brain admits no cure. Why is her brain weak or wounded? Because she's a woman. So she says, now you notice this is about Demosthenes, but she never mentions them by name. Why not?
To show that she's not as maybe intellectual or whatever the neoclassicist or...
Actually, probably just the opposite of that. I mean, she doesn't mention him because if you're a neoclassicist, you ought to know all about Demosthenes. So she's not going to insult your intelligence by saying who it is. But she still puts the story in, so you do have to figure it out. And she's certainly showing off on that. And then, she does something clever, and then she follows it up with that ingenuous denial. Oh, but I just have a weak or wounded brain, so there's nothing I can do about that. Really clever word choice in this next stanza. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue. Anybody know what carping means?
Distracting.
Nitpicking, fault finding. So, in other words, anybody who's looking to find fault, I'm obnoxious to. Now, obnoxious has two meanings. It means deserving of censure or punishment, or vulnerable to censure or punishment. In other words, they read that as I deserve to be picked on. She's really saying I'm vulnerable to be picked on because I'm a woman. Who says my hand a needle better fits? What's that all about?
A woman's work.
You're doing a woman's work. She should be darning Simon's socks. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong by picking it up. For such despite they cast on female wits, if what I do prove well it won't advance, they'll say it's stolen, else it was by chance. But you're the antique Greeks. Now remember how they loved the Greeks. And it looks like she's complimenting the Greeks. But sure, the antique Greeks were far more mild. Far more mild than who? About women. The neoclassicists, and maybe even the Puritans. Else of our sex, why feigned they those 9? And policy made Calliope's own child. So the Greeks must have liked and admired women, or they wouldn't have made the muses goddesses and put them in charge of the arts. She's showing off here. There's 9 muses, and she knows the names of all of them and what they're in charge of. Calliope happens to be the muse. There's 3 or 4 muses in charge of different kinds of poetry, and she picks the one that's in charge of the epic. So again, she's showing off. And she says, well, the Greeks must have liked women a lot more, or they wouldn't have made the muses women. So amongst the rest they place the arts divine. But this weak knot they will full soon untie. The Greeks did not, but play the fool and lie. What was the status of women in ancient Greece? Pretty much as bad as it was in her day. Women weren't thought to have any intellect. In fact, if a man came over to discuss business with the husband, the wife was sent out of the room like the children, because she wouldn't be able to understand it. She knows the Greeks didn't have any more respect for women than the neoclassicists did. And that word antique means old or ancient. But you could also pronounce it antic. And antic means crazy. When Hamlet says, when he's going to pretend to be crazy, he says, I'll put me on an antic disposition. So she's saying, on the one level, it looks like she's saying, but the ancient Greeks were nicer, when she's really saying the crazy Greeks, because they pretended to be nicer to women, they really weren't any nicer than neoclassicists. There's another classical allusion in the Greeks did not but play the fool and lie. One of the great heroes, Ulysses, always referred to by Homer as the wily Ulysses, is known for his lying. In fact, he never tells the truth. He's always got some subterfuge or some kind of a plot going on. And she says the Greeks are all like that. They all plan. Also, one of his favorite disguises, one of his favorite tricks, was to go disguised as a beggar or a fool into the enemy camp to get information. So he says the Greeks are all like him. They lied and they played the fool. They played the fool and they pretended that they liked women when in fact they really didn't. Let Greeks be Greeks. It's almost boys will be boys. And women what they are. What do the neoclassics think she means by that? Let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. What do they think women are? Nothing. Childbearing machines. So let women be what they are. Let the Greeks, the wonderful Greeks, be the Greeks, and let women be what they are, just nothing. What she's really saying is let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Women don't get to be what they are. They have to fit this mold of being empty-headed, and they're really not. And this is sarcasm here. Men have precedency and still excel. Precedency means ceremonial priority of order. Men go first and they still win. Isn't that amazing? It is but vain unjustly to wage war. What war?
Sexes.
The battle of the sexes. And there's also a literary allusion there. The Iliad about the war about Greece and the war between Greece and Troy. The Greeks say is fought, Paris, the Prince of Troy, comes to visit, and he stays at the house of Menelaus, one of the kings, who's married to Helen of Troy, the most beautiful nymphomaniac in the world. And she basically seduces Paris, and they run off together. Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother, comes and wants a war. Menelaus says, don't be silly. She's always sleeping with somebody else. I look like a fool. Let her go. I don't want her. Besides, she'll betray Paris sooner or later. They'll kick her out of Troy. She'll have nowhere to go. She'll have to come back here. I'll have the upper hand for the first time ever. And Agamemnon says, are you crazy? It looks like the Greeks can't hold on to their women. We have to say that he kidnapped her and raped her, and in order to preserve her honor, we have to attack and destroy Troy. And that's what they do. So it's an unjust war. It's as unjust as the war men wage against women. Miss Lan, I always imagine her biting her lip before she read this and saying to herself, God, don't let me laugh. Men can do best, and women know it well. What did all the neoclassics and the men at the table say when she read that line? Good idea. Well said, Anne. That's certainly true. What did all the women at the table say? The sad thing is they didn't. The women generally said, that's certainly true.
Out loud. Out loud they said.
No, most of them did believe it. That's the sad thing. You would think that they wouldn't because some of them were wives. They had husbands. And yet they still thought men could be smarter for this reason. What's the standard for smart? The neoclassicists. Well, more than that. Even a man has to. You have to know about Greek and Latin. So when they sat there and said, well, he couldn't find two socks that matched by himself. If I died, he wouldn't be able to feed himself. He'd starve. He knows all that Greek and Latin stuff. So he must be smarter than me. I think that's where Anne makes the breakthrough. When she gets to the third part of that argument, she says, well, he knows all that Greek and... Wait a minute. I know more Greek and Latin than Simon knows by a long shot. Women aren't dumber than men. There may have been a couple women around the table stuffing napkins into their mouth and saying, I swear I was not laughing, coughing, I was joking, that's what I was doing. But most of them were nodding right along with Anne and saying, with the men and saying, yes, that's certainly true. Men know best and women know well. How could any women come to that conclusion? People square their reality with other people. For some reason, none of us trust that what we feel is real. Have you ever said, is it cold in here or is it me? You don't trust your senses? There's a psychology experiment. If we took somebody who wasn't here, and we agreed that when they came in next week, one at a time, we would go up to them and say, are you feeling all right? Are you sure you're okay? Well, you look sick. You sure? By the time the 5th person goes up, I'll say, I felt good when I came in here. I'm feeling a little bit queasy now. People verify their reality with everybody else. Everybody says men are smarter. Your mother says men are smarter. So you come to believe it. There's a thing called cognitive dissonance, which means how many times your experience has to contradict what you believe before you'll revise what you believe. And it's amazingly high. And so women probably had proofs all the time that men weren't smarter than them, where they could see their husbands making mistakes, but couldn't say anything about it. But no matter how often that happened, everybody knows what everybody knows, and what everybody knows are men are smarter. You notice that she's not as vehement about her feminism as she could have been. I mean, this is a really bright woman who is deprived really of the opportunity to compete on the same level as men. That must have been enormously frustrating to her. Why don't we see more anger? Why don't we see a more forceful statement of feminism here?
Probably wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been accepted.
It wouldn't have been accepted. First of all, it isn't like there's a big women's movement out there just waiting for somebody to set off the spark. There isn't. The idea of women's equality is a good 50, 75, 100 years away. So it's not like it was going to do any good if she did make a forceful statement. And again, this is where the intellect comes in. Emotionally, she must have been very frustrated and very angry and wanted to get that out. But what happens to Simon if she makes a vehement statement of the equality of women?
His intellect would be viewed as low.
They're going to wonder about him. How can you let your wife make statements like that? How can we let you run a colony when you can't even run your family? Look in the Bible. It says women are inferior to men. How can you let her mention that heresy that women aren't inferior to men? What kind of Puritan are you? What kind of man are you? What kind of governor must you be? Now, if they get rid of Simon and fire him as governor, what happens to Anne and the children? It goes down. Their lifestyle goes down. Anne knew that any really forceful statement she made would only rebound on Simon. And I think partly it was sheer practicality. I don't want to embarrass him, get him fired, we'll all be in trouble. Nothing will be gained by it. And the other thing is I think she really loved Simon. And she knew this would be enormously embarrassing for him if she made those vehement statements. And so to spare him having to deal with that, even if Simon would have agreed with her, which he might have done. Remember, he did treat her like an equal. He talked to her like an equal, and they went over his day and his work and stuff. So he might have agreed with her, but he could never have said so publicly. Not as a man, certainly not as a public figure. So it might have been out of love that she doesn't do it. It might have been out of simple practicality, and it might have been because she didn't think anybody would have listened, even other women. Preeminence in each and all is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. You get praise for everything. At least give us a little bit of credit. O ye high-flown quills that soar the skies. Now our editor says the quill is a quill pen, but he's missing the classical allusion. Anybody know what animal was the symbol of poetry in the classical tradition?
No.
The winged horse Pegasus. So these are guys whose quill pens are made out of feathers that drop from the horse of poetry. And ever with your praise, still catch your praise. No matter what it is you bring home, everybody says you did a wonderful job. If ever you lower yourself to look at these poems, if e'er you deem these lowly lines your eyes, give time or parsley read. I ask no bays. The bay leaf was the crown that they gave to the winners of the Olympics. And the original Olympics wasn't just running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin. It was also poetry and drama. So she says, all right, if you want to give me you want to give me a gold medal, don't give me the typical laurel leaf. Give me parsley or thyme. Why parsley or thyme? Nobody knows what they are?
They're
Spices.
They're spices. Just give me a wifey crown, something low calorie I can turn into a salad later. Don't give me anything like you would a man, anything serious. This mean, if ever you look at my poetry, this mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold the more to shine. Keep my terrible poetry around, because it'll make your poetry look so good. What's the easiest way to manipulate men?
Compliment them.
How?
Oh, wait, let me write all this down.
Compliment them. Compliment them, yes. Oh, these stains in the tub, I just don't have the arm strength for that. Arm strength? Here, let me do that, dear. Oh, you want the garbage taken out forever without having to say so? This is really wonderful, but I could concentrate on it so much more if I wasn't thinking about that garbage upstairs. Down.
When is she saying that?
When would be the most opportune time to say it? Women never miss the timing. When would be the most opportune time to say that?
Yesterday, Valentine's Day?
All you have to do is tell men they're wonderful in bed and they'll do anything for you. All you have to do is praise them. And look what she does. She tells these guys, my poetry will make yours look so good. And the really humiliating thing for us men is that it worked. The poetry was apparently kept around. They fell for it. Said, well, we will keep this around and we'll show everybody how bad it is and that'll make us look so much better. And I don't know if she expected it, but she probably hoped that eventually she would have an audience that would be able to see all of the stuff that she put into the poem, which the neoclassics were incapable of seeing just because they knew it couldn't possibly be there. And as it turns out, she was right. It's one of the reasons why I think her poetry's lasted so long. Although most people don't like this poem as her best poem. Mostly people like the other poems because they talk about daily life and their experiences that everybody can plug into. But when you realize the tricks that she's playing here, and the cleverest thing of all is, this looks like a neoclassical poem. It's filled with classical allusions, but what is it that makes it metaphysical? How many meanings does it have?
More than one.
More than one. They think she's like those poems about sex or death. They think she's writing a poem that's being humble, and in fact, she's skewering them all the way through. Anybody have any questions or comments on Anne Bradstreet?
What's it the poem to?
A long epic, a religious epic poem, a real long one. And so again, they were going to be even more hostile, so she had to play to them even more. And she does play them. All right, we're going to